If you have $1,500,000 sitting in your retirement account at 55 and you think you're set, there's a number hiding inside that balance that most people never see until it's too late. That number is roughly $150,000. Gone. Not to the market, not to inflation. To taxes and penalties you could have legally avoided. Here's the situation. You get a layoff notice. Maybe a severance package. You look at that $1.5 million and you feel okay. You've done the work, you've been disciplined, and now you're thinking about bridging the gap, living off that money until you can claim Social Security, until Medicare kicks in, until things settle. So you go to pull some out. And that's when the math starts falling apart. Because that $1.5 million, it's not $1.5 million. Not really. Not in your hands. Not without a plan. A lot of financial media will tell you $1.5 million is the minimum you need to retire at 55. And they're not wrong. It's a real benchmark. But the number they're giving you is pre-penalty, pre-tax, and built on retirement assumptions designed for households earning $60,000 a year, not yours. If you spent 30 years in a career that paid well, the standard framework doesn't fit. It wasn't built for you. Today I want to walk through exactly why $1.5 million gets misread. By the media, by the calculators, and sometimes by the people who hold it, and what it actually takes to use that money without handing a chunk of it back to the IRS before you even buy a plane ticket. Let's start with the article you've probably already read. Investopedia, Bankrate, NerdWallet. They all run some version of the same piece. Is $1.5 million enough to retire? And the math they use looks clean on paper. Take $1.5 million. Apply the 4% withdrawal rule, get $60,000 a year. Add Social Security, say $2,000 a month, and you land somewhere around $84,000 a year. Case closed. Except that math was built for someone earning $50,000 a year before retirement. Not $200,000. Not $300,000. According to Federal Reserve data, households with $1.5 million or more in liquid retirement assets sit in the top 4% of American families by wealth. And that group, on average, earned between $200,000 and $400,000 a year during their working years, which means their expenses, their lifestyle, and their Social Security benefit look completely different from what those articles assume. Here's where the SSA math actually lands for a high-income household. A couple where both spouses earned well, say one at $180,000, one at $120,000, can realistically expect somewhere between $4,800 and $5,500 a month combined at full retirement age. That's roughly $57,000 to $66,000 a year, not $24,000, not the $2,000 per person. Number the generic articles keep using. So before you even open the 401k, Social Security alone is likely covering more ground than the calculator told you. But the bigger problem isn't the Social Security assumption. It's the withdrawal assumption. The standard articles tell you to pull 3% to 4% a year from your portfolio. What they don't say is that if you're 55 and that money is sitting inside a 401k or a traditional IRA, you can't just reach in and take it. Not without a cost. The IRS charges a 10% early withdrawal penalty on any money you pull from those accounts before age 59 and a half. That's on top of ordinary income tax. So take John. He's 55. He's got $1,500,000 in his 401k. He needs $100,000 this year to cover living expenses. He pulls it out. Federal income tax on that withdrawal, in his bracket, runs around $22,000. Then the 10% penalty, another $10,000. He puts in for $100,000 and walks away with roughly $68,000. He needed $100. He got $68. And he'll do this every year for the next 4 to 5 years if he doesn't change the approach. Run that out over 5 years at $100,000 a year in withdrawals, and the penalty alone costs him $50,000. That's the $150,000 gap I mentioned at the start. It's not a rounding error. It's a structural problem built into how most people access their money before 59 and a half. Now, here's the thing about John. His problem isn't the size of his account. He has enough. His problem is that no one showed him how to open it the right way. That feeling, I have the number but something still feels wrong, that's not paranoia. That's a real gap between what the media presents as a retirement plan and what actually applies to your situation. $1.5 million is enough, but only if you know how to access it without letting the IRS take a seat at the table every single year. There's a specific kind of stress that doesn't show up in any retirement calculator. You're 55. The severance package just landed. The number in your account has 7 figures. By every objective measure, you are fine, more than fine, and yet something in your chest won't settle. Within a few weeks, you're refreshing job boards, updating your LinkedIn, telling yourself it's just to keep options open. But the real reason, the one most people don't say out loud, is that sitting still feels wrong. It feels irresponsible. Like you're getting away with something you haven't earned yet. I've watched this happen more than once. Smart people, successful people, people who did everything right for 30 years. They hit the number, and instead of stopping, they go find another job, usually one that pays less, carries more stress, and has nothing to do with what they actually want. Not because they need the money. Because their brain is telling them they're in a crisis. That's the trap, and it has a name. When your exit from the workforce is unplanned, a layoff, a buyout, a restructuring, your nervous system doesn't register it as retirement. It registers it as unemployment. Those are 2 completely different psychological states, even when the bank balance is identical. Retirement is a finish line you chose. Unemployment is something that happened to you, and your brain treats them accordingly. I remember that feeling described to me by someone who had $3 million and still went back to work part-time, not for the income, for the feeling of having a paycheck, because after 30 years the paycheck wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that he was contributing. Proof that he still mattered. The account balance didn't give him that. The direct deposit did. That's not a character flaw. That's 30 years of conditioning. Here's the reframe that actually helps. The severance package, or the buyout, or the early retirement offer is not a consolation prize. It is startup capital. It is the seed funding for the next phase. You didn't lose a job. You got handed the runway. The guilt you feel about not going back is the old system talking. The system that measured your worth in billable hours and performance reviews. That system is done with you. The question is whether you're done with it. Your identity as a provider, as someone who shows up and delivers, that doesn't disappear when the salary stops. It changes shape. But walking back into a role that diminishes you just to feel legitimate again is a trade most people regret within 18 months. Once you give yourself permission to call this what it is, retirement, not unemployment, the financial decisions get cleaner. You stop making choices from panic. You start making them from position. And that matters because the next decision is a technical one. It's about how you actually access the money you've built, without handing a significant portion of it back to the IRS before you've spent a single dollar on anything you care about. So you're 55. You have $1,500,000 in a 401k or IRA. You need income now, not at 59 and a half. And you just learned that pulling money out the standard way costs you 10% before the IRS even gets to your income tax bracket. There are two legal ways around that penalty. Most people have heard of one. Almost nobody talks about the other. The first is the rule of 55. If you leave your job in the calendar year you turn 55 or later, you can pull from that specific employer's 401k without the 10% penalty. No special setup required, but it only works on the 401k from the job you just left. Roll that money into an IRA and the exemption disappears. And if your money is spread across older 401ks from previous employers, those accounts don't qualify at all. It's a useful rule. It's just a narrow one. The second is IRS Section 72T, specifically a structure called SEPP, Substantially Equal Periodic Payments. This one applies to any retirement account, 401k, traditional IRA, rollover IRA. You set up a series of annual withdrawals calculated by one of 3 IRS-approved methods. You commit to that schedule for 5 years, or until you reach 59 and a half, whichever comes later, and you pay 0 early withdrawal penalty. None. The math on this is straightforward. Say you need $60,000 a year from your IRA starting at 55. Under a standard early withdrawal, that $60,000 triggers a $6,000 penalty on top of your income tax. Do that for 5 years, and you've handed $30,000 to the IRS that you didn't legally owe. With a properly structured 72T plan, that $30,000 stays in your pocket. I've seen people pay exactly that, $30,000 in unnecessary penalties over 5 years, because their advisor wasn't familiar with how to set up a SEPP schedule correctly. It's not exotic. It's published IRS guidance, but it requires precision. If you modify the distribution amount midstream without an IRS-approved reason, the exemption collapses retroactively. Every penalty-free year you took suddenly becomes taxable again, with interest. This is not a DIY project. You need a fee-only advisor or a tax professional who has actually set up SEPP schedules before. Not someone who has read about it, someone who has done it. But when it's set up correctly, 72T solves the access problem entirely. You get consistent, penalty-free income from your retirement accounts starting at 55. You control the draw. You stay out of the IRS's penalty lane. The rule of 55 handles the easy case. Section 72T handles everything else. Getting out of the penalty is one problem solved. But there's a second problem waiting. And in 2026, it's gotten considerably more expensive to ignore. For about 7 years, Americans had access to some of the lowest income tax rates in modern history. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 dropped the brackets, widened the bands, and gave high earners significant breathing room. A married couple could pull $100,000 in retirement income and stay in a relatively manageable tax position. The math worked. That law expired on December 31st, 2025. As of January 1st, 2026, the old brackets are back. The 25% bracket is back. The 28% bracket is back. The 33% and 35% brackets are back. And at the top, the 39.6% rate has returned. For someone in the income range we've been talking about, drawing $150,000 to $200,000 a year from pre-tax retirement accounts, that shift is not minor. It's a meaningful change to how much of every dollar you actually keep. Here's what that means in practice. If you pull $100,000 from a traditional 401k in 2026, and that pushes your household income into the 28% bracket, you're netting roughly $72,000 after federal tax. 2 years ago, that same withdrawal in a lower bracket might have left you with $78,000 or more. The account balance didn't change. The withdrawal amount didn't change. But you're walking away with $6,000 less every single year just because the law changed. That's not a small number over a 20-year retirement. And here's the part that matters for longevity planning. The Social Security Administration's 2026 actuarial tables show that a healthy 65-year-old man in the United States can expect to live to somewhere between 84 and 87. For women, that number is higher, which means if you retire at 55, you're not planning for 10 years. You're planning for 30. 30 years of pulling from a pre-tax account at post-2025 tax rates is a very different equation than what most retirement projections assumed. This is why the sequence of your withdrawals matters as much as the size of your account. A dollar pulled from a taxable pre-tax account in a high-rate year is a more expensive dollar than one pulled from a Roth account, or from a taxable brokerage where only the gain is subject to capital gains rates, which are still lower than ordinary income rates. The people who built their retirement savings entirely in traditional 401ks made a reasonable decision at the time. Pre-tax contributions lowered their taxable income during high-earning years. That was the right move then. The question now is different. Now the question is, in what order do you draw from those buckets? And how do you keep your taxable income low enough to qualify for ACA subsidies before Medicare kicks in at 65? Because there's another number hiding in the 2026 tax picture that almost nobody accounts for until they miss it. Let's put a real number on the decision to keep working. Say you're 55, you have $1,500,000, and you're telling yourself you'll work until 65 just to be safe. That's 10 more years. And on the surface, that feels responsible, prudent, like the kind of decision a serious person makes. But here's what you're actually trading. The years between 55 and 65 are, for most people, the last window of genuinely good health. Not perfect health, but functional, mobile, energetic health. The kind where you can travel without managing a medication schedule. Where a long hike is a choice, not a question. Where you can be present with grandchildren in a way that involves more than sitting. You don't get those years back. And if you spend them in a job that's draining you, for a number you already have, that's not prudence. That's a transaction with a hidden cost the spreadsheet never shows. Now let's look at the two financial paths, because the math here is not as close as people think. The first path, you retire at 55 without a plan. You start pulling from your traditional 401k, $120,000 a year to cover expenses. That withdrawal gets counted as ordinary income. It pushes you into a higher tax bracket. It also pushes your household income above the ACA subsidy threshold, which means you're paying full price for health insurance, potentially $2,000 to $2,500 a month for a couple, until Medicare starts at 65. And if a bad market year hits early, you're selling assets at a loss to fund that same lifestyle. The second path, you retire at 55 with a plan. You draw from a taxable brokerage account first, where gains are taxed at capital gains rates, not ordinary income rates. You supplement with a properly structured 72T distribution from your IRA. You keep your reportable income low enough to qualify for meaningful ACA subsidies. You leave the bulk of your pre-tax accounts to grow untouched, or to be converted gradually into Roth at lower tax rates during years when your income is intentionally managed. Same $1,500,000. Same retirement age. Completely different outcome. The difference between those two paths, in taxes paid, in healthcare costs, in portfolio longevity, can easily reach $200,000 to $300,000 over the 12-year bridge to Medicare and full Social Security eligibility. Not because one person was smarter, because one person had a sequencing strategy and the other didn't. This is the work, not finding a bigger number, not working longer, sequencing what you already have. If these strategies are useful to you, subscribe to the Wes Investor channel. This is exactly the kind of planning I cover. Not theory, not general advice, but the specific mechanics of protecting what you've built. Every dollar you've earned deserves a strategy, not just a balance. Everything we've talked about assumes a reasonably stable market in the early years of your retirement. The market doesn't care about your assumptions. There's a risk in retirement planning that doesn't get enough attention in the standard articles. It's called sequence of returns risk. And it's not complicated. It just has consequences that are easy to underestimate until you're living them. Here's how it works. Two people retire with identical portfolios, $1,500,000 each. Same average market return over 20 years. But one of them hits a 20% market drop in year 1. The other hits that same drop in year 15. The person who hits it in year 15 is fine. Their portfolio had 15 years to grow before the drawdown hit. The losses sting, but the math recovers. The person who hits it in year 1 is in real trouble, not because the market dropped. Markets recover, but because they needed $100,000 to live on that year. So they sold shares at the bottom. Those shares are gone. They don't participate in the recovery. And the following year, they need another $100,000 from a portfolio that's already down. The depletion compounds in a way that average return calculations never capture. A $1,500,000 portfolio hit by a 20% drop becomes $1,200,000 on paper. But if you pulled $100,000 out during that drop to cover expenses, you're starting year 2 at $1,100,000. Not $1,200,000. That $100,000 difference doesn't come back. It was sold at the worst possible moment. I've been close to situations where this played out in real time. Someone who looked fine on paper, who had done the saving, who had the number, but had no liquidity buffer when the market turned. They weren't reckless. They just didn't have a plan for the sequence. The fix is not complicated, but it has to be built before you need it. A cash bucket, 18 to 24 months of living expenses held in something stable. A money market fund or short-term treasuries means you never have to sell equities at a loss to pay next month's bills. The portfolio gets time to recover. You don't have to make a panic decision during a down market because you already made the calm decision before one arrived. Fidelity estimates that a couple retiring in 2026 should expect to spend somewhere between $330,000 and $350,000 on healthcare costs over the full course of retirement. That number alone is an argument for keeping a liquidity buffer, not because the market will drop, but because expenses in retirement are not optional and not always predictable. Sequence risk is the thing that turns a solid retirement plan into a fragile one. The account balance is only part of the story. The structure around it is what determines whether it lasts. So let's bring this down to the ground. If you're 55 with $1,500,000 in retirement assets, Here are the 4 moves that separate a fragile plan from a resilient one. First, find out what you actually have. Not the account balance, the post-tax value. A $1,500,000 traditional 401k is not $1,500,000 in spendable money. Every dollar you pull from that account gets taxed as ordinary income. Run the real number. What does $1,500,000 become after federal tax, state tax, and, if applicable, early withdrawal penalties? For most people in this range, the honest post-tax figure lands somewhere between $900,000 and $1,100,000, depending on their state and their bracket. That is your actual starting point. Plan from that number, not the gross balance. Second, if you're leaving work before 59 and a half, get a 72T SEPP structure in place before you start drawing, not after. The schedule has to be established correctly from the first withdrawal. Find a fee-only advisor or a CPA who has set these up before, not someone who is familiar with the concept, someone who has filed the paperwork. The penalty for getting this wrong is retroactive. You don't want to find that out 2 years in. Third, before Medicare starts at 65, health insurance is your largest uncontrolled expense. ACA subsidies are income-based. If you can keep your reportable household income below the subsidy cliff, which in 2026 sits at 400% of the federal poverty level, roughly $80,000 for a couple, you may qualify for significant premium assistance. That requires managing which accounts you draw from and in what order. It's not automatic. It's a decision you make at the start of each year. Fourth, build the cash bucket before you need it. I always keep at least 18 months of living expenses in a money market fund. Liquid, stable, separate from the investment portfolio. Not because I expect a crash, because having it means I never have to sell equities under pressure. That buffer is what lets the long-term portfolio do its job without interference. These 4 steps don't require a perfect market. They don't require working until 65. They require a clear picture of what you have, a legal structure for accessing it, and a sequencing plan that keeps your tax bill and your healthcare costs from undoing the math. The account balance got you here. The structure is what keeps you here. Subscribe to Wes Investor if you want to go deeper on any of these. The 72T setup, the ACA subsidy strategy, the bucket framework. This is the work, and there's more of it coming. $1,500,000 is not a magic number. It never was. It's a tool. And like any tool, what matters is whether you know how to use it. If you pull from the wrong accounts in the wrong order, $1,500,000 becomes $900,000, Daniels, in real spending power before you've taken a single vacation. If you ignore the 72T structure and pay the early withdrawal penalty for 5 years, you hand back $30,000 you didn't owe. If you retire without a cash buffer and a bad market year hits in month 8, you're selling at the bottom to pay your grocery bill. None of that is inevitable. All of it is avoidable. The psychological part matters too. If you leave work at 55 because a layoff made the decision for you, your brain will call it unemployment. It will push you back toward a paycheck you don't need, into a role that costs you the healthiest years you have left. Recognizing that pattern, naming it, is half the work. The people who get this right are not smarter. They're not luckier. They just stopped using a framework that was never designed for their situation and built one that was. $1,500,000 is enough. If you know how to open it, see you in the next one.